Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Pavan, and what an honor to be here, speaking with Derek and with all of you, and I've learned a lot from people at Duquesne and on many things, and on Lacan in particular. I know there are some eminent Lacanians here, and I don't claim to be a Lacanian full stop myself, but a person with a great interest in Lacan, and trying to bring him into line with other modes of thought that have been important for me and that have been central to the tradition of Duquesne. So my talk, Lacan and Phenomenology, was subtitled The Mind of the Modernist. Let me begin. French thought in the 20th century is typically described as marked by a major fault line, a rupture or grande coupure, a great cut that emerged in the 1960s, the heyday of the so-called crisis of the subject. Prior to this time, French philosophy, together with associated fields such as psychiatry and psychoanalysis, were focused on issues of subjectivity, first in the vein of Bergsonian vitalism, but then shifting with Sartre and Merleau-Ponty in the late 1930s and 1940s to forms of phenomenology and existentialism inspired first by Husserl and then even more decisively by Heidegger. But starting in mid-century, developments in the human sciences of linguistics, anthropology, and psychoanalysis began to offer a different perspective. With the rise of some later thinkers, the most important being Lévi-Strauss, Jacques Lacan, Althusser, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, the focus of theoretical attention shifted. It turned away from individual human consciousness and its dilemmas, away from belief in the potential self-transparency and sovereignty of the subject or self, and toward the more objective and supposedly determining structures of language, collective myth or ideology, and social institutions. Lévi-Strauss dismissed the focus on subjectivity, individualism, and what he called the supposed continuity of the self, and the, quoting from him, the allegedly self-evident truths of introspection. He dismissed all of those. The goal, he said, Lévi-Strauss, was not to constitute, but to dissolve man. Many followed Lévi-Strauss's lead in denouncing the so-called primacy of consciousness and the autonomy of the subject, phrases I'm taking from several of the histories of French thought, often associated with the so-called Cartesian subject. Lacan, in particular, seemed to spurn existentialism and existential psychoanalysis out of hand, and he dismissed as, quote, profoundly delusional, end quote, the, quote, discourse of freedom, essential to modern man insofar as he is structured by a certain conception of his own autonomy, end quote. Derrida rejected the phenomenological method on the grounds that Husserl's assumption of an indivisible self-presence with its privileging of, quote, the actual present, the now, end quote, of immanent experience was an egregious instantiation of the self-deceiving metaphysics of presence of Western philosophy. Anyone familiar with these ideas, and I think most of the audience probably is, will have encountered what seems a stark opposition. On one side, the defenders of the self or subject and the primacy of individual subjectivity, under the humanistic aegis of phenomenology and existentialism. On the other side of an abyss, the tougher-minded partisans of determining semiotic structures, marching under the banners of structuralism, post-structuralism, and the so-called true psychoanalysis. One implication of this schema, this historical rendering, is that the work associated with the second, supposedly anti-humanist group is assumed to be irrelevant, if not actually opposed to the study of either subjectivity or the individual subject, except perhaps insofar as it shows these latter to be epiphenomena or illusions. No more than what Foucault in 1966 called, quote, a sort of surface effect, a shimmer, a foam, end quote, cast up from the more decisive plane of language and social structure. There are, however, certain facts of intellectual history that should make one feel uncomfortable with this opposition. It's interesting, for example, that the most important so-called post-structuralists began as adherents or at least close students of phenomenology. The most obvious reason to question the standard schema lies, however, in the fact that one of the most influential influences on Lacan and Foucault, as well as Derrida, was of course none other than Martin Heidegger, one of the two founding figures of phenomenology. Indeed, it seems fairly clear in retrospect that both the structuralist and post-structuralist critiques were centered not on phenomenology in general or in its diversity, but on Sartre and Husserl in particular. The first treated with good reason Sartre as an absolutist regarding freedom, the other as a Cartesian foundationalist regarding method, Husserl. Here we might think of a concept often employed by some of Lacan's disciples, that of the vanishing mediator. That Heidegger might be such a figure is apparent when one recalls his close link to both sides of the supposed rupture, the grande coupure. All this is obvious, I think, so obvious, in fact, that one may wonder how its implications could ever have been ignored. If Heidegger's significance has been occluded, it is surely because he has been hiding in plain sight all along, sometimes the best way to vanish. In recent years, a number of writers have in fact been calling attention to the influences of various phenomenologists on post-structuralism. Here I am less interested in demonstrating influences, important as those are, than in examining affinities, and in particular in demonstrating the relevance of some key post-structuralist contributions for the essentially phenomenological project of clarifying subjectivity or lived experience, and in particular for the history of the subject. It's useful to think of the crisis of the subject, especially of the subject's supposed freedom or self-transparency, as involving two distinct, though not unrelated, levels. Whereas the first level concerns the qualities or capacities attributed to the actual human subject or person, the vision of the human person, or what's sometimes called philosophical anthropology. The second level concerns a more epistemological or methodological plane, pertaining to the philosopher's or other theoreticians' potential for discovering the truth about the human condition or human consciousness. The crisis of the human subject, as understood by both the structuralists and post-structuralists of mid-century Paris, is a crisis on both levels, though with shifting emphasis depending on context. The individual human being's belief, or at least the bourgeois Western European's supposed belief, in his or her subjecthood is declared an illusion. At the same time, the very project of describing subjectivity is called into question, both for being impossible on epistemological grounds, given the supposed impossibility of valid self-reflection and thus of phenomenology, and as being trivial in its potential yield, since subjectivity is supposed to be but a shimmer or foam riding atop the real events. This at least has been the prevailing orthodoxy or ideology of both structuralism and post-structuralism. It is the key lesson that figures like Lacan, Foucault, and Derrida, and many of their followers, claim to have drawn from Freud, Saussure, and Levi-Strauss. It can be difficult to assess the real import or seriousness of these claims. They do sound at times like a wholesale refusal of the very notion of the person or the individual, which of course are among the most foundational concepts of Western culture. One might wonder as well about the legitimacy of concepts and distinctions that have readily been assumed. Post-structuralism is known for its critique of essentialist overgeneralization and polarizing. Yet this entire discussion displays all the marks of such oversimplification, including an either-or attitude toward the existence of a self or subject, and the facile assumption that certain tendencies are necessarily linked. But we may ask, must freedom or self-transparency really be conceived as either absolute or else non-existent? Do they always go together like aspects of a single whole? Does a sympathy for phenomenology necessarily imply a belief in subjectivism or a sovereign self? What I'd like to do here is to look beyond or beneath the standard level of polemics and proclamations, which in my view have been taken far too seriously. I want to ask whether this critical vision associated with post-structuralism, with its supposedly radical rejection of both subjecthood and subjectivity, is or need be seen as being truly characteristic of the contributions of Jacques Lacan, that is, of the actual concepts and novel perspectives that are his most important legacy. And by the way, many similar points could be made about Michel Foucault, but I won't discuss those here. I have elsewhere. My purpose is to show the potential relevance of Lacan's key notions for the phenomenological project broadly conceived. That is, not for furthering this or that particular philosopher's signature approach, but for exploring subjectivity in its disclosure of what Merleau-Ponty called the mystery of the world. To do this, however, it will be useful to recall the significance of what Heidegger, our vanishing mediator, terms the ontological dimension. His focus on what he terms being, sometimes capitalized, capital B, being, rather than beings in the plural. So a few words about Heidegger on the ontological difference. A crucial passage in Being and Time for understanding the entirety of Heidegger's work is one in which he describes the phenomenological project in somewhat contradictory terms, as seeking to describe something that is at the same time omnipresent and obvious, yet also hidden and obscure. And this, says Heidegger, is that most decisive yet subtle of dimensions, the being, let's say with a capital B, of entities. So let me quote here from Being in Time, with some ellipses that I'm not going to mention. I'm just going to read it straight through. It's abbreviated a bit. What is it that phenomenology is to let be seen? Manifestly, it is something that does not show itself initially and for the most part, something that is concealed, in contrast to what initially and for the most part does show itself. But at the same time, it is something that essentially belongs to what initially and for the most part shows itself, indeed in such a way that it constitutes its meaning and ground. But what remains concealed in an exceptional sense, or what falls back and is covered up again, or shows itself only in a distorted way, is not this or that being, small b, but rather, as we have shown in our foregoing observations, the being of beings, end quote. Now, Heidegger directs the phenomenologist's attention not to any particular object or, as he would say, ontic entity, but to what he calls the theme of ontology, which is the overall way in which everything shows up, especially regarding its felt quality of reality or the lack thereof. Ontology is possible, writes Heidegger, quoting him now, only as phenomenology. The phenomenological concept of phenomenon as self-showing means the being of beings, end quote. It is this most general ontological dimension, call it the world's form or manner of presence, that is for Heidegger the very heart of our existence as subjective beings, yet that is so readily forgotten, ignored, or distorted by reification and other distortions that seem to come as naturally to us as breathing. Essentially, writes Heidegger, quoting now, nothing else stands behind the phenomena of phenomenology. Nevertheless, what is to become a phenomenon can be concealed. And precisely because phenomena are initially and for the most part not given, phenomenology is needed, end quote. Heidegger describes what he calls the ontological difference as the difference between being and beings. He notes that for a particular entity to be perceived or recognized, for example, say within a given science, but also for a given subject, individual subject, the very possibility of such an entity must first exist. Heidegger describes this a priori aspect of being as a part of what he calls, quote, the perceivedness of something extant, which nevertheless belongs to the Dasein, end quote. The latter term being, of course, Heidegger's attempt to refer to the subjective sphere without implying the usual Cartesian distinctions. This quality of being or presence is not any kind of object and cannot be treated as the object of even a direct phenomenological contemplation. The central purpose and highest calling of phenomenology, we might say, is to disclose this dimension of disclosure. It is to bring to explicit or theoretical awareness this ontological sense of reality in general, the deepest and most decisive level of our experiential lives. Now, let me move to Lacan and his three registers. The phenomenological and specifically Heideggerian implications of Lacan's contribution can best be demonstrated by considering the core of his theoretical vision, which is his notion of the three registers of human reality: real, symbolic, and imaginary. At first, this may seem surprising, given that each concept clearly does imply, on some level, a confrontation with what might be termed the illusory nature of our lived experience. Closer consideration will show that each of these notions can, in fact, also be understood in a rather different light. Let's start with Lacan's overtly anti-phenomenological thrust, beginning with the imaginary register, as presented in his famous analysis of the mirror stage. Here, Lacan suggests that our sense of having an autonomous ego or self is, in fact, a sort of subjective illusion, the illusion of being a subject, or at least a certain kind of subject, coherent and in control. And he suggests that this illusion is based on internalizing the objective image we see of ourselves in a mirror or other source of reflection. Lacan himself offers this argument as a refutation of the notion, epitomized by Sartre and presumably accepted by phenomenology, or at least some phenomenology. Lacan refers dismissively in the essay to the, quote, contemporary philosophy of being and nothingness, which of course is Sartre. And this is the notion that one is indeed an autonomous and self-aware subject. That is, quoting from Lacan, a self-sufficiency of consciousness and the illusion of autonomy, end quote. And that this truth is somehow incontrovertible, an immanent fact of experience itself. The anti-phenomenological import of the symbolic order, moving now from the imaginary to the symbolic, seems equally telling. Here, Lacan presents a realm that is understood to lie beyond our conscious grasp, a realm of semiotic structures encompassing the unconscious, which is structured like a language, supposedly, yet which, in contrast with the illusions of the imaginary, supposedly constitutes the actual matrix and motor of much of our experience and action. For Lacan, as for Lévi-Strauss before him, it is clear that we are not the masters of the language-like structures. Regardless of what our immediate experience may seem to tell us, it is language that speaks us rather than the reverse. The anti-phenomenological thrust may seem most obvious of all in Lacan's discussion of his third register, the real. Here, after all, we are dealing with a realm that is in some sense actually defined by its inaccessibility to our experience. A realm that Lacan associated with Kant's notion of noumenal reality, reality in itself, and that is specifically conceived in contrast with the manifest phenomenal realm of our lived experience. The very existence of the real may well seem the ultimate refutation of phenomenological complacency, or indeed of any expectation that examination of our consciousness could provide an inventory of what there is or could be. It is understandable then that Lacan's registers are so often conceived as undermining any image of a free and self-transparent subject or self, and also the notion that subjectivity is either an accessible or a consequential realm. What these registers seem to reveal is rather that our experiential lives are largely illusory, the imaginary, epiphenomenal, the symbolic, or simply blind in the case of the real. Much of what I've just said about Lacan's vision of the deceptions and blind spots of our experiential lives is not only true, but crucial for any understanding of his perspective. A more extended consideration of each register will nevertheless show that Lacan can more accurately be viewed as a potential contributor to than as an enemy of phenomenology. To see this, we need to think of phenomenology not as presupposing or vindicating the sovereign or self-transparent self, but as a tentative and exploratory disclosure of subjective life in its more formal or ontological dimensions. Not, that is, as a Cartesian project in the manner of Husserl, of seeking a realm of absolute clarity and certitude, whose possibility is assumed, but as an exploration of subjective life as it actually exists, with all its limits and constraints and realms of blindness. On Heidegger's ontological and hermeneutic account, human subjectivity is not and cannot be either self-grounding or fully self-transparent. Bearing this in mind, each of Lacan's three registers or orders can be understood as constituting something like a Heideggerian mode of being, being with a capital B. This is not, by the way, to say that this is the only way they need to be understood. I argue that Lacan contributes to phenomenology, not that he's entirely or solely a phenomenologist. Now here I have space only to sketch, or time only to sketch these dimensions. That the imaginary, despite its generating of illusion, is a mode of experience is perfectly obvious and indeed explicit in Lacan's account. In this sense, Lacan's account of the imaginary realm just is, on one level, an account of one crucial dimension of what it is like to be a living human being. The fact that the imaginary is a partial, in some sense deceptive realm, does not gainsay its own experiential reality, its actuality as a form of experience or mode of experience, nor its relevance for a phenomenological account of a key aspect or dimension of subjectivity. The very rhetoric of the mirror stage essay, in fact, clearly presupposes on the part of the reader at least some capacity to evoke in oneself, to reflect upon, and to assess experiences like those standing before a mirror or in the gaze of another. In this sense, a significant degree of, if not self-transparency, at least, shall we say, self-translucency, does seem to be assumed on the part of the reader. Indeed, it is difficult to see how a meditation like that of Lacan on the imaginary could get off the ground without some such assumption. In this sense, the mirror stage essay and his analysis in it simply assumes the possibility of phenomenology. And in the context of another of his analyses, Lacan does ask, quote, "Is this a correct phenomenological analysis?" End quote. Moving now to the symbolic, which is often described in structural terms, and in this sense is not directly a phenomenological fact. It should be clear, however, that Lacan's symbolic has various sorts of relevance for our subjective lives. It does, for example, lend a certain polarizing tendency to our sense of things, grounded in the diacritical nature of language, and this becomes a feature of our lived world. But perhaps the crucial feature of the symbolic in Lacan's account is how the advent of linguistic symbolism supposedly cuts us off from a pre- or sub-linguistic experience of the world that we experience in its absence and as an absence as somehow more authentic and immediate, thereby tinging our very experience of being with a pervasive aura of loss. Lacan describes this event as a kind of castration, but goes on to view it as the essential generator of our desire, which is at bottom the desire for a return to something that is felt to be both primordial and forbidden, hence dangerous and infinitely alluring, what Lacan refers to as the thing, and sometimes as the objet petit a. In these ways, the symbolic act is of great phenomenological relevance, since it both generates and constitutes certain modes of subjective life. One should note as well the profound influence that Heidegger's notion of die Sprache, language, understood as the fundamental source of disclosure, had on Lacan's notion of the importance of la parole, human speech. As for the real, it needs to be recognized that what Lacan is interested in is not, in fact, the actual noumenon, or reality in itself, as it, say, really is or might be. The notion of the real is rather, at least in large part, a way of capturing the role that our sense of otherness, limits, and the unknown can actually play in our subjective lives. The real, we might say, is a kind of unknowable and unattainable beyond that refuses to leave us alone. It is the unexpected surprise that confounds expectations, yet assaults us again and again with implacable repetition. One might say then, to put things in a maximally paradoxical way, that the Lacanian real is concerned with the phenomenon of the noumenon, not with the in itself, but with the in itself for us. One could say then that each of the Lacanian registers describes a form of being in the Heideggerian ontological sense, an overall way in which one can and does experience the world and oneself. The imaginary is that mode of subjective life in which what is most actual or real tends to be identified with that which has distinct gestalt-like form. The symbolic is that mode in which being is experienced as involving categorical polarities and a sense of abstraction from something more grounded or authentic. The real is that mode in which the very eluding of our conceptual perceptual grasp serves as the ultimate index of being. The affinities with Heidegger's project should be clear. One could describe Lacan as offering an ontological characterization of much of what Freud interpreted in more ontic, entity-like fashion. I would note, however, that Lacan's vision has the advantage for a psychologist of ascribing more than a single experience of order or a single mode of being to a given subjectivity. In contrast, for example, with the historical analyses offered by both Heidegger and by Michel Foucault. I'm thinking especially of Foucault's focus on epistemes and the order of things. We must remember, after all, that Lacan's three registers are not only conflicting, but also interdependent and mutually defining. His tripartite account opens up the possibility of an ontological account that is more complex and dynamic than anything offered by Heidegger or Foucault, for example, grounded in the various forms of interdependency and opposition that can exist between these orders or regimes. It should be noted, by the way, that each of Lacan's three registers is grounded in something distinctly human, that is, in one or another feature traditionally seen as unique to and definitive of the human essence. Self-consciousness, in the case of the imaginary. Language, in the case of the symbolic. Awareness of mortality and of a realm that exists somehow beyond, in the case of the real. All things perhaps unique to human beings, or so we like to think. Humanism is a polysemic term, and it is clear that Lacan does show disdain for self-satisfied liberal humanism and engage in much anti-humanist polemics. He does not, however, show any real inclination toward Levi-Strauss's ambition, quote, from Levi-Strauss, to undertake the resolution of the human into the non-human. It should be obvious, I think, that experiential dimensions, such as those captured by Lacan's registers, do not and cannot lend themselves to the kind of clarity and certitude to which Husserl, in his Cartesian moments, was drawn. A phenomenology of this kind is more in line with Heidegger, especially the later Heidegger, perhaps, for it puts a higher premium on the evocation of profound existential and ontological realities than it does on hopes of incremental progress of a methodological sort, let alone the attainment of what Husserl often described as apodictic certainty. Okay. I'm going to skip a little bit here just to say I was going to have a little bit on the concept of the self in Lacan and dispute the idea that Lacan is an anti-humanist in this sense either, that he does recognize the, and even sort of recommend the acts of volition in which one takes up a project and things like that, which is a very, very similar to many things that Sartre has to say. Just to conclude, all these points taken together show the absurdity of reading Lacan's work as anything like a straightforward attack, either on the self or on the possibility of some form of valid phenomenological reflection. As we've seen, his work, too readily labeled as anti-humanist, is preoccupied with distinctively human dimensions of culture and the person. Lacan needs to be understood as making important contributions to the philosophy as well as the history of the subject, with this latter conceived in large measure as a quintessentially phenomenological project. Thank you very much.